What if I told you this wasn't just a success story, but a perfectly timed setup hiding in plain sight? Because somewhere between the fame, the hits, and the flashy lifestyle, a $25 million question was quietly slipping through the cracks, and nobody noticed until it was already too late. So how does a rising star go from unstoppable momentum to being at the center of a mystery that nobody can fully explain? And more importantly, who actually benefited the most when all the smoke cleared? Because on the surface it looked like mentorship, like opportunity, like a dream come true. But behind the scenes, insiders are starting to suggest something far more calculated, something that feels less like guidance and more like a masterclass in control. And if even a fraction of these whispers are true, then what you are about to hear is not just another industry story. It is a breakdown of how power really moves when millions are on the line, and trust becomes the most expensive mistake of all. It always starts with a deal that sounds too good to question, and that is exactly where this story begins, with a rising star hungry for success and an industry veteran who already knew how every corner of the game worked. Because when you look at how Pooh Shiesty was coming up, everything looked like a movie, viral moments, street buzz turning into mainstream attention, and a cosign from none other than Gucci Mane, who built his name not just on music, but on understanding how to turn talent into profit. And right there is where things start to get interesting, because people saw mentorship, but insiders are now suggesting something very different. Something a lot more calculated, because when a young artist steps into a situation like that, they are not just signing a deal, they are stepping into a system that has rules they don't fully understand yet, and according to whispers floating around industry circles, those rules were already tilted in favor of the person who had been playing the game for years. Because this wasn't just about putting someone on, this was about structuring everything in a way that guaranteed control. And control in this business is everything. Control over music, control over image, and most importantly, control over the money. And when people started looking closely at how the paperwork might have been set up, questions began to surface about percentages, ownership, and who really benefited from the success that followed. Because let's not forget how fast things took off. One hit turned into multiple, streams started stacking, shows started selling, and suddenly there was serious money on the table. The kind of money that doesn't just come from music, but from branding, appearances, and deals happening behind the scenes that the public never gets to see. And that is where the number starts to come into play. The 25 million that has everybody talking, because according to certain unnamed sources, that figure represents more than just earnings. It represents what could have been handled very differently if the power dynamic wasn't so one-sided. And now people are going back and analyzing every step of the journey, from the initial signing to the rapid rise, asking whether everything was as straightforward as it looked, or if there were layers that only a few people fully understood. Because in this industry, perception is everything. You can make something look like a win while structuring it in a way that benefits you long-term far more than anyone realizes in the moment. And that is exactly the kind of strategy that experienced players rely on. They don't just think about today, they think about how every move will pay off years down the line. And if the rumors are even partially true, then what we are looking at is not just a successful artist being guided to the top. It is a situation where every step forward also meant giving up a piece of something much bigger, and the craziest part is that from the outside, everything still looked perfect. Interviews were clean, appearances were solid, and there was never any obvious sign that anything was off. Which is exactly why this story is hitting so hard now, because nobody saw it coming. Nobody expected that behind all the success there might have been decisions being made that would later raise serious questions. And as more people start to speak carefully about what they think really happened, the narrative is shifting from celebration to suspicion. Because once money of that level gets involved, people start asking different kinds of questions, they stop looking at what was gained and start focusing on what might have been lost. And in this case, that shift in perspective is opening doors to conversations that were never meant to happen publicly. Because if there is even a chance that one side walked away with a significantly bigger piece of the pie than the other realized, then this is not just another industry story. This is a lesson in how power works when experience meets ambition. And right now that lesson is unfolding in real time as more details slowly begin to surface. And as those details started surfacing piece by piece, the story began to take a sharper turn, because what once looked like a simple success pipeline suddenly started resembling something much more strategic. Almost like every move had been mapped out long before the spotlight ever hit. And this is where things get even more intense, because anonymous insiders began hinting at conversations that never made it into official records, late-night meetings, quiet agreements, and verbal understandings that carried weight without ever being written down. And in an industry where paperwork is supposed to be everything, the idea that millions could be influenced by trust alone raises serious eyebrows, Because trust in this game can either make you rich or leave you wondering where it all went wrong. And according to these sources, there were moments early on where the structure of the deal could have been questioned, but momentum was moving too fast. The hits were coming in, the fame was building, and when everything around you is blowing up, it becomes harder to slow down and analyze the fine print, because success has a way of distracting you from the details that matter most. And while Pooh Shiesty was busy turning tracks into anthems and building a name that was spreading across the culture, the business side of things was evolving at the same pace, but with a level of complexity that only seasoned players like Gucci Mane fully understood, and that is where the narrative starts to feel less like mentorship and more like positioning, because every endorsement, every feature, every opportunity came with layers attached. Layers that may have seemed standard on the surface, but carried long-term implications that weren't immediately obvious. And when people began looking into how revenue streams were allegedly split, how publishing might have been handled, and who had the final say in key decisions, the picture started to shift in a way that made the entire situation feel a lot more calculated than anyone initially thought. Because when you control the structure, you control the outcome. And if the structure was designed in a way that prioritized one side over the other, then everything that followed was already leaning in a specific direction. And that is exactly what some of these so-called leaked insights are suggesting. That from day one, there was a blueprint in place that ensured maximum benefit for the person who knew how to play the long game. And as the money started flowing in from streaming platforms, brand deals, and live performances, that blueprint began to reveal its true impact. Because what looked like shared success on the outside may not have translated equally behind closed doors. And this is where the public reaction started heating up. Because fans who once celebrated the collaboration are now questioning whether they were witnessing a genuine rise or a carefully managed operation. And social media didn't hold back. Theories started spreading, clips were being reanalyzed, and every old interview suddenly felt like it contained hidden meaning. Especially moments where subtle comments hinted at business decisions without ever fully explaining them. And once those clips started circulating, the narrative gained even more momentum, because people love a story where the truth feels just out of reach, where every new piece of information adds more questions instead of answers. And that is exactly what is happening here. Because for every claim that surfaces, there is another layer that complicates it, making it harder to separate fact from speculation, but easier to believe that something bigger might be at play. And while none of this has been officially confirmed, the consistency of these whispers is what keeps the conversation alive, because when multiple voices start pointing in the same direction, even without hard proof, it creates a sense of possibility that is hard to ignore. And that possibility is what fuels the idea that the 25 million figure is not just a random number, but a symbol of how much could have been influenced by decisions made early in the process. Decisions that seemed minor at the time, but carried massive consequences later. And as this narrative continues to build, it is becoming clear that this is no longer just about music or even money. It is about perception, power, and the ability to shape a story in a way that benefits you the most. Because in the end, whoever controls the narrative often controls how the truth is remembered. And right now, the narrative is shifting in a direction that is making people question everything they thought they knew. And just when it seemed like the speculation had reached its peak, the entire situation took an even darker and more complicated turn. Because the deeper people started digging, the more it began to feel like this wasn't just about a deal or even about money anymore. It was about timing, control, and how quickly circumstances can change the entire trajectory of a career. Because right at the height of everything, when the numbers were climbing and the spotlight was at its brightest, things suddenly slowed down in a way nobody expected. And that shift created a vacuum where even more questions started to grow, because when momentum stops in an industry that thrives on constant movement, people don't just wonder what happened. They start connecting dots that may or may not even be related. And in this case, those dots led straight back to the business structure that had been quietly sitting in the background the entire time. Because now the conversation was no longer just about who earned what. It was about who maintained control. When everything else started falling apart, and that is where the narrative becomes even more intense. Because some voices began suggesting that the very system that helped build the success was also perfectly positioned to benefit from any disruption. And if that sounds uncomfortable, that is because it is supposed to. Because the idea that setbacks could shift financial advantage in favor of one party over another is exactly the kind of scenario that keeps people questioning the true nature of these relationships. And while there is no official confirmation of any intentional strategy, the way certain elements allegedly lined up has been enough to keep the rumors alive and growing, because when you combine a high-value catalog, contractual control, and unexpected interruptions in an artist's ability to capitalize on their peak, You create a situation where ownership becomes far more important than visibility. And according to some of these ongoing discussions, that is exactly what happened behind the scenes, where the focus quietly shifted from building momentum to managing assets. And in a business where masters, publishing, and rights can generate income long after the spotlight fades, that shift can mean everything. Because even when the public attention moves on, the money doesn't necessarily stop. It just flows in different directions. And that is the part that has people looking at this entire story from a completely new angle. Because if the foundation of the deal was structured in a way that allowed one side to retain significant long-term control, then the impact of that structure would only become more visible when circumstances changed. And that is exactly what seems to have triggered this wave of speculation, because now every detail is being re-examined not in the context of success, but in the context of who ultimately holds the keys to what was created, and that question doesn't just apply to one situation. It reflects a much larger pattern within the industry where new artists often step into agreements without fully understanding how those agreements will play out over time, especially when external factors come into play that were never part of the original plan. And as people continue to debate what really happened here, the story has evolved into something much bigger than the individuals involved. It has become a symbol of how power operates behind the scenes, how influence can shape outcomes without ever being visible to the public, and how easily perception can be controlled when the right pieces are in place. Because at the end of the day, most people only see what is presented to them, the success, the lifestyle, the highlights, but they rarely see the structure holding it all together. And it is that structure that determines who truly benefits when everything is said and done. And whether or not the full truth of this situation ever comes out, the impact of these questions is already being felt. Because artists are paying closer attention, fans are becoming more skeptical, and the idea of blind trust in business relationships is starting to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that not every opportunity is as straightforward as it seems, and that sometimes the biggest wins on the surface can hide the most complicated realities underneath. And as this conversation continues to spread, one thing remains clear. The difference between being part of the success and owning it is something that can only be understood when it is already too late. And by then, the narrative has already been written, the deals have already been signed, and the outcome has already been decided, leaving everyone else to piece together what really happened long after the moment has passed. If this story really made you question how the industry works, then hit like and drop your thoughts below, because the truth might be deeper than what we see. Subscribe now for more shocking breakdowns, because the next story might be even bigger than this one.